Hello everybody, and happy Monday, and I hope everybody is well despite, of course, all the ongoing challenges that we're currently living through. I'm Richard Brabner, Director of the UPP Foundation, and it's my real great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar from the Civic University Network and UPP Foundation. Today's event marks the publication of two new reports from the Foundation linked to the Levelling Up and Building Back Better agendas. And if you haven't had the chance to take a look at our reports, links to them have been provided in the chat function. And before we start, we wanted to mention a few guidelines for how we're going to run the events. All participant cameras and microphones will be disabled for the duration. However, we very much encourage event attendees to ask and engage with the session. If you've got any questions for the panel, then please direct this through the Q&A function. Any other commentary, information sharing, networking can be done via the chat function. Due to time restrictions, we may not be able to answer all the questions, although we will endeavour to do so. So please be aware also that the session will be recorded, and a recording of the event along with any outputs will be made available in due course and will be on YouTube and social media and so forth. And talking about social media, if you're a Twitter user like me, do tag us, do use the Truly Civic hashtag as we go through the event. So today's event is in two parts. We're going to start the proceedings with Jonathan Simons from Public First, providing us with a whistle-stop tour of the new reports. And then this will be followed by a stellar cast of panelists who I'll introduce a little later, and they'll be responding and talking about some of the issues this agenda picks up in the context of their institutions, places and sectors. After we've heard the introductory remarks from the panel, we'll open it up for questions about the reports or anything that you've heard in the discussion, to me, to Jonathan, to any of our panel members. But before I hand over to Jonathan, I'll share a scene for our reports and share a few of the highlights. We embarked on this project a few weeks before the election last year as a follow-on piece of public policy to our Civic University Commission. We knew that from that report and others, that universities play a really important civic role. But while many universities have some form of regional engagement, historically, we think it's fair to say that universities' civic role has tended to be focused, understandably, on the cities and larger towns they reside in. To what extent, then, does the civic benefit spill out more widely into areas like post-industrial towns where a university is not present? Recent analysis has shown that growth and productivity has not flown, not just from universities, but across the board, from cities to satellite towns. In other words, activity in a city or large town may not naturally spread to other towns and may actually make the gap between the two even larger. And as we know, many of the most vulnerable places in our country are small and medium-sized towns. So the initial aim of this project was to look at what role universities can play, particularly in post-industrial towns. This is not just the right thing to do, but pragmatically, it's also important for our sector to show the contribution universities can make to the Levelling Up agenda. We'd initially envisaged publishing this report in April, but of course the world's changed and we decided to take stock and look again at how relevant our report was given the changes forced upon us and continue to be forced upon us by COVID. And instead we decided to publish not just one report, but two reports, two for one. The first, our shorter report, looks more specifically at the current crisis in relation to employment. We all know that the health emergency we are currently going through is going to morph into an unemployment crisis. Indeed, the Bank of England estimates that job losses will exceed those from the global financial crash of 2008, and that was before lockdown 2 was introduced. We've taken data from the Centre for Cities and Centre for Towns and overlaid this with qualifications data to paint a picture of the number and proportion of people vulnerable to unemployment in towns and cities across the country. And overall, we estimate that there are around 5 million jobs at risk. We've also polled non-graduates to ascertain their feelings about retraining, and the results present a real challenge to the government's lifetime skills guarantee. Non-graduates want higher level training rather than just a new level 3 qualification, and are not motivated to retrain in areas of skill shortages in the economy. So our report calls for a better balance between support for immediate labour market needs and what learners want to do. And greater flexibility so more learners are able to access retraining and education through local universities and colleges, including for shorter and more technical courses. This in effect, we think, to help people back into employment will be the major agenda for civic institutions in the months and years following the pandemic. The second and larger report is what we originally envisaged publishing. It focuses on the role of universities in levelling up towns, and our recommendations are based around an analysis of A, the factors which are needed to regenerate areas, B, the local challenges universities have a locus on, and C, we ran polling and focus groups in 3 post-industrial towns to find out the issues that the public want to see action on. And from this, we've made a series of recommendations based on 5 areas universities can focus on in their efforts to extend the civic role to struggling towns where a university isn't present. And finally, I just want a message to government and other policymakers who may be on this call. When it comes to the civic role, while there continues to be external and commercial funding opportunities to support this agenda, it has largely been paid for by tuition fees. In recent months, it's been said that universities are key to supporting their communities overcome the crisis, that their civic role has grown in importance. But as many have said, there's likely to be less money for teaching each student in future, so something has got to give. If we want universities to deliver on levelling up during a time of financial uncertainty and declining resources, to provide evening classes for adults, revitalise deprived towns, support NHS capacity, improve educational attainment, increase the local impact of R&D, there needs to be both support from government, but also for universities to be willing to go above and beyond to enable this to happen. A mutually supportive partnership of government, universities, local authorities, and other local civic players presents a real opportunity to make our formerly left behind towns no longer left behind. So on that note, I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan, who will brief you on some of the report's key analysis, findings, and recommendations. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you to UPP Foundation for this. I'm just going to now share my screen to talk you through, as Richard says, the main conclusions of this work. As Richard said, we're publishing 2 reports today through the Foundation looking at the role of universities, and I'm just going to spend the next 15 minutes or so taking you through some of those conclusions. So the first report was about preventing the COVID health crisis from becoming a jobs crisis, and as Richard said, the latest estimates from the Bank of England is that we will see job losses exceeding those in the financial crisis of 2008. And so in this report, we ask 3 questions. What is the likely geographical spread of those vulnerable jobs? And how does that relate to the locations of universities? What is the skill composition of those who are at risk and who may lose their job? And again, what does that mean for universities? And thirdly, what do individuals who lose their job or may lose their job want in terms of getting them reskilled and back into the labour market? And we're publishing today through the Foundation an interactive map which looks at the geographic nature of those vacancies. And we did that through using Centre for Towns and Centre for Cities data and calculating the percentage and raw numbers of jobs in those areas which are vulnerable. This is not the same as saying these are forecast job losses. So our numbers of 5 million are total vulnerable jobs rather than 5 million people who we forecast will lose their jobs. And we then look at the labour market composition in those towns and cities and look at where universities are in relation to them. And that I'll just show you a few screenshots from the map, but it is available on the Foundation's website today, so you can look at what it means either for your university or for the towns or cities that you live in. So if you look at the map, this is what you see. This is what we're calling here the left behind towns. These are the most deprived towns in the UK pre-COVID using Centre for Towns methodology. What we're calling shutdown towns, which are the 50 towns where a greatest proportion of the labour market is vulnerable from a COVID shutdown. So these are particularly towns who are very high in hospitality, retail, entertainment. The yellow dots are core cities. These are the major cities of the UK. And then the grey dots are where the universities in the UK. And what the map allows you to do is either to click on particular towns and cities or to click on particular universities. This is showing you what happens if you click on a town. This is Mansfield, and it shows you where the nearest universities are, and it gives an estimate of the job losses and jobs at risks, and a breakdown by what we call low and medium skilled population. These are people with a level 3 qualification at max. And you can see here, and it's a reasonably typical example, that in Mansfield we have an approximate labour market of just over 67,000 people, of whom, again, very typically about 65% are medium skilled, non-graduates, and a reasonable proportion of jobs at risk. The other way of looking at it is you can see on the left-hand side here, there's the ability to filter by university. So we've chosen Teesside University here. And if you zoom in on Teesside universities, you can see that there's an estimate that the total nearby jobs at risk to Teesside University is just over 100,000 jobs, of which about 85,000 are low and medium skilled. And you can see on the right-hand side there, some of the towns and cities close to Teesside University and what the breakdown of that might look like. So this map allows you to either search by university or by town and city and look at the estimates of job losses and the estimates skilled. And what do we conclude overall? Well, as I said, we conclude that at least 5 million jobs are at risk, and these jobs are spread throughout the country. This is not going to be a localized jobs crisis because of the scale of it. Having said that, certain areas of the country are going to be more affected, either because they are left behind already and they have a more vulnerable labour market, or because they have labour market composition, which is more vulnerable to a COVID shock. So if you have lots of people in a local town employed in hospitality, in retail, in entertainment, they are going to be more vulnerable, particularly as we now enter a second lockdown. But the impact is going to be spread nationwide, and we estimate that around 2.1 million jobs are at risk in medium-sized towns up and down the country. But actually the majority of job losses, just given the size, are in cities. So this is not a left behind story. This is not a story of deprived areas getting more deprived and flourishing cities continue to flourish. There will be significant job losses throughout the country. A high proportion of those will come from what we think are medium skilled or low skilled people, those who hold a maximum level 3 qualification. So around 3.1 million of that 5 million are low and medium skilled people. And for universities, this essentially means wherever you are in the country, whether you're in a city, whether you're in a town, whether you're in a fairly high skilled area or a lower skilled area, there will be a cluster of job losses on your doorstep, figuratively and literally in many instances. And particularly from essentially today, the furlough scheme is being extended for a period of time, but we're already seeing significant job losses. It's likely to be, despite the extension of the furlough scheme for however long the next lockdown lasts for, this is not systematically going to impact the very, very large number of job losses we see. And so the other thing that we talk about in this report is, haven't the government already announced a way they're going to solve all this? Haven't we got a free lifetime training allowance to all of these people? And yes, we do, but it's actually a very limited scope. It is only eligible to those people who don't already have a level 3. So this is just people who are level 2 qualified. And although the eligibility hasn't yet been announced, it's likely, given every indication, that the eligibility for retraining is likely to be limited to shortage skills area in the economy only. So it will not be up to you to decide what you want to retrain in. You will be given a course eligibility, and that will likely be in a very restricted number of people. So when you take all that together, we estimate that the vast majority of non-graduates who could lose their job, 75 to 80%, or 2.5 million to 2.8 million of the 3.1, would not benefit from this scheme. And of those who might be eligible, and we'll show this in a second, their motivations and desires are a lot wider than just coding. So a lifetime skills guarantee is actually a guarantee for people who don't even have an A-level or equivalent to go and do a specified course that the government is about to announce. And it is likely, to say the least, that that is not going to meet the actual demand of what is needed. And in order to illustrate that latter point, we're producing some polling today of 1,000 non-graduates. This found that many non-graduates are unaware of the scale of economic disruption that may be about to hit them. Around half of non-graduates are not looking for a new job, and over half of non-graduates think that their industry is not essentially going to change in the next 10 years, despite the fact that almost all economic evidence says to the contrary of that. A lot of people do want to change jobs, and a lot of them do recognise that they want to change industry or career, but only about a third of non-graduates think that they'll definitely need any form of new training. And a further third think they'll need it for some jobs, but not for others. Under half of the people who this scheme is in theory aimed at think it is of interest to them. And almost as many think that it's not. Interestingly, bearing in mind this is all a non-graduate sample, a large proportion of non-graduates do want to go and get a degree at some point. These are not necessarily people who have actively turned off the university route. So a plurality of 18 to 24-year-olds and a plurality of 25 to 30-year-olds and a pretty big majority of 35 to 44-year-olds would like to get a degree at some point. It's actually only after the age of 45 that those numbers start to tail off. So again, we talk here about lifetime training, we talk about universities' role in levelling up. The vast majority of people who are not involved in this show some interest in going to university. But when we ask them what they want to do and we give them a number of courses and disciplines to choose from, over 8 out of 10 don't choose even the most popularly chosen topics. People's interests and motivations are very wide. They are not motivated by the fact that their job is in a shortage occupation. The fact that there are lots of jobs available in a sector does not drive people to make job decisions. So when you combine the fact that the eligibility for this lifetime skills guarantee is restricted both by discipline and by prior qualification level, you can see why we are very firm in making the conclusions that this simply doesn't touch the sides of what people are going to want. So that's the first report. The second report is thinking more broadly around the civic engagement for the post-industrial towns. And as Richard says, this builds on the original Civic University Commission. And this was originally begun in many ways what seems like a lifetime ago. So we've had a Brexit deal, a not Brexit deal, another Brexit deal, a general election, and a global pandemic since we started doing all of this. But in many ways, the report still develops the main concept of place and universities' role as a civic actor, despite all of the work that's gone on. And in the time we've been writing it, there's been other very, very good work produced on this, which we wholeheartedly endorse, including the UK 2070 Commission and the HEPI paper from Day and Al on how universities can drive economic and social resurgence in the UK. This is a well-worn topic. It's a topic of huge policy interest, and there's a lot of excellent work going on at the moment. But really the questions we asked in this report were, what role can universities play in so-called left behind areas where they don't have direct provision? And we don't talk about satellite campuses in this report. For the purposes of this report, we discount the question of satellite campuses. That was a very traditional, very attractive solution a while ago. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't. We're not saying they are never the solution, but for the purpose of this report, we discount the possibility of a satellite campus. We're looking at what else the university may choose to do. Secondly, we're looking at what a university can realistically do, either in the lead or in partnership with civic actors. And a lot of this needs to be done in partnership. And the third question, and often overlooked, is actually what does your local population want you to do? If you are, as a university, interested in working in a town near you, what does that population want you to do? And it draws from some polling work, which has already been released by the Foundation a few months ago, and some focus group work in 3 of these towns, in Darlington, Dudley and Oldham. And I'll just very briefly recap what that found. In terms of the polling, we found that universities are supported by their general population, with the majority of the population wanting universities to get involved. The main thing that general public want their local university to do are to do with education. They want universities to play an educative role, which is, after all, one of their main functions. They also want the universities to be a local economic actor. The public want institutions to hire locally, to improve the local area, and particularly when it comes to public sector training, to encourage those public sector graduates to stay and live and work in public services in and around the area. You may have seen this finding before. We talk about this finding an awful lot, but a third of the people have never visited their local university. And this includes people who live in cities and towns with many universities near to them. A majority of respondents, going back to the first report, think that actually universities should be involved in lifelong learning and lifelong retraining. They don't see them as places where 18 to 21-year-olds are educated. And in general, there's apathy towards most civic institutions. The civic role is popular in theory, but actually when pushed on public, most public are fairly apathetic about what most institutions were. Universities do okay, but they do better than politicians, but there's nothing particularly special about them. In terms of the focus group work we did, Awareness of institutions was high and was positive. People could name, these are non-graduates in these towns, when we went there, could name the universities around them very, very swiftly. But very few of them, again, echoing the polling, had ever visited their universities, and few of them could say anything they did. And in many ways, the universities felt very disconnected from the area. People sitting in the focus group room knew that the universities were there. Some of them had a satellite campus in their town. Some of them knew that it was just down the road or a short train journey away. But in many ways, they didn't feel that the universities was part of the local community. They felt very disconnected. The focus group talked about the universities as if they were entirely hypothetical institutions. People liked the idea of the universities helping in their area, but were completely bewildered when we asked them what that could actually do. And there was a quote which I think sums it up, which was someone said with complete bewilderment to me, why would somebody studying maths want to help the homeless in this town? The two were seen as entirely different from each other. A university is a seat of learning. Fine, great if they want to help out, but what could a university possibly do to help this town? And instinctively, people felt the universities were self-interested institutions. When we posed particular things that universities could do, people felt, well, yes, but why would they do that? Why would a university hire locally? They'll just get the best people they can. Why would a university buy from local suppliers? They'll just do what they can. Universities are essentially acting in their own private interests. If that happens to coincide with a local interest, great. But if not, then you can't blame them. I wouldn't blame anyone for not working in this town. Why would you want to? But when prompted and when guided through, the clear priorities came out around regenerating a town centre, around giving opportunities to local children, and around getting training for jobs. So we put all of this together and we created this interlocking Venn diagram, which we published today in the report. And there's really three ways of looking about what a university can do. There are things that they have a natural locus on, things that a core institution of teaching is going to do. In the left-hand side here, there are things which the population of an area would like a university to do. And then on the right-hand corner are things which are likely to have a significant impact on the economic and social impact of the local area. And you can see, and we can debate and discuss whether these are in the right circles or not, but what we end up with is a collection of issues which we think are in the middle or close to in the middle, where universities have at least some locus on, or can at least be partners with, that they express some popular support and are likely to have an impact on the local area. And the four here that we really talk about, we've talked about jobs in the separate report, is really about attainment, about high streets, and about the NHS. And if you're thinking practically as a university, I want to do some more civic work, I want to engage, I want to help a local town in and around me, what are some of the practical things which I could do in partnership with my colleges, with my local councils, with my local NHS? These are, we think, priority areas for universities to think about. Not all of them. Some of them will have different priorities. Some of them will have different specific things they can do. Some universities will have a natural specialism that is not in here. But in general, this report posits that these are some of the ways in which you can start to make a practical difference, including where, as a university, you don't have an actual campus. And we make 5 sets of recommendations just to finish this off. The first one is we talk about how universities can help boost high streets. And we think that the Towns Fund is a way of doing this. And if you'll have seen some of the media coverage that's been in the Times today about this, this is one of the things that's been picked up, is that actually we think there is a possibility here of dedicated capital funding where universities would bid in partnership with other local actors to create new capital estate on the high street or in and around high street in town centres, where universities would act as an anchor tenant for a number of years. That doesn't have to be lecture facilities. It could be facilities that they use for volunteering. It could be where universities work with supporting businesses. It could be the incubation centres or the innovation hubs, which lots of universities have. It can be a place where you let your premises to third parties. It could be almost anything. But the idea is that it creates footfall in the town and centre, and the university is there for a period of time that attracts the capital funding. The second thing we talk about is building on the National Tuition Programme, which has been announced by the government to really help think about what universities can do to raise attainment for under 18s. This is not the same as widening participation work. This is not the same as getting people to go to university. It is about raising attainment at schools, maybe through multi-academy trusts and school sponsorship, which the government was very, very keen on, but it doesn't need to be. The basic premise is that universities are, we think, well placed to raise under 18s attainment, and we think should be a key priority. The third recommendation we make is really building on how universities have stepped up to deal with the COVID crisis, and many of them have given up their facilities, given up their labs, fast-tracked through medical professionals. We think there's a case for designating them as a primary surge capacity provider to the NHS. What this essentially means is funding them to run permanent excess capacity in the university funded by the NHS. The idea is that in normal times, the universities can use that themselves. So they will be funded to have additional labs, potentially funded to train additional staff, funded to do additional research, with the idea being that as and when needed, those can be ready as a first call of surge capacity to the NHS. So rather than having to scrabble around and it just happens that University X has got some additional reagents it can give, and that was sometimes literally the case in March and April, just happened to who had some chemicals sitting around in the lab, you'd build this on a more systematic basis. And we think that universities being core as that help the NHS is going to be absolutely critical. Fourthly, we look at how we can build the research programme of looking at how to level up post-industrial towns. And this can be quite highly applied practical research as well as theoretical research. And we think there's a case for using an element of the Shared Prosperity Fund to really drive this research programme. And lastly, we talk about already the rebadging of the lifetime skills guarantee. There's £2.5 billion that's been attached to that by the government. We think, as Richard said, there's a need for greater balance between what the labour market needs and what students need. And if we are going to have hundreds of thousands and millions of people unemployed, we think that actually spending £2.5 billion on something which is not going to touch the sides of 20% of the people is an absolute critical aim. To get all of this right, the Civic University Commission talked about a new Civic University Fund. We called for 500 million. We now think that given the scale of the challenge, that is insufficient. So we talk about a dedicated pot, and this is the additional government funding that Richard talked about at the beginning. That needs to fund a lot of these programs. Universities cannot do this out of goodwill. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And if universities are going to be core to civic resurgence, there needs to be funding. The rest of the funding we think can come from reallocation. So we talk about a reallocation of the Towns Fund that can lead to capital rebuild. We think there's a lot here in terms of third-party commercial income that can be crowded in. Research partnerships and contract work is going to be critical to this. If universities, as indeed many of you are doing, can really focus on increasing productivity and increasing business growth and increasing absorptive capacity, together with the R&D funding, which we also talk about, we think that's a huge revenue stream here, which can be talked about. And then lastly, but not least, the rebuild of the national skills funding. So there's a huge amount in here. I'm conscious that I've galloped through it at very, very high speed, but between the polling, the new polling out today, plus the additional polling from February, the focus group work on what local participants want, the interactive map showing how it will impact your local university and your local towns and cities, and the theoretical work on the role universities can play. We think there's a huge amount of material here to be worked through as universities in partnership with the foundation and with the Civic University Network start thinking about how you can continue to deliver this agenda over the coming years. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's brilliant. Thank you for giving us that whistle-stop tour of the two reports. Before I move on to the panel, just to, there's some great questions coming in, everybody. So please do keep sending in your questions. Jonathan, there's just a definition point at the top. Somebody asked us about satellite towns. Now, obviously, we focus grouped in places like Dudley and Oldham and Darlington, and we perceive those satellite towns to be those places that within the orbit of a bigger city, but not part of them. If you want to provide a better definition than that, Jonathan, then please do. But there's also a question here before I move on to the panel, which I think is a really interesting one, is how do you balance the needs of the disadvantaged in big cities against those in small towns? So I don't know if you want to take that first before I move on to our panelists.
Yeah, so two good questions. So in terms of satellite towns, for the purposes of constructing the map, we said any town that was within 25 or 30 kilometres of a university based. That's not a hard and fast definition. Every local economic geography will have its own town, and you will have a sense as a university as to which towns are within your orbit. In some areas, depending on transport links, it would have to be somewhere quite close. In others, it will be further away. But we had to pick a distance to make the map work, but we very carefully not nationally designed an orbit, because economic geography is different. In terms of how universities balance this, yeah, I mean, look, there's lots of really good questions here. Because universities can't do everything, what you will need to do is you'll have to trade off. Can we really work on all of these 5 priority areas at once? What about the disadvantaged in our cities? You know, your own analysis shows that there's going to be more job losses in cities and towns. Shouldn't we focus on the ones that are right on our doorstep? Those are all good questions. And again, we set out here in some ways a toolkit for universities rather than saying you almost do all of this. It may well be, as a university, you judge that most of your impact can be in creating retraining and supporting job losses in your cities. If you're in a city, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I think the only thing I would say is, as Richard alludes to and is in the report, the trickle down effect, and I use that word advisedly, or the spillover, positive spillover effect that has been hypothesized to come from university cities and university towns out to their orbit does not appear to be as strong as was previously hypothesized, and certainly not as strong as it is in other European countries, for example. So if you look at the in France and Germany, what's called the subnational regional growth in and around university areas spreads out further than it does in the UK for reasons which are not fully yet understood. So the one small caveat I would make is that there is a risk that just focusing on, for example, people who lose jobs just in your town or city may cause that issue to widen. So, but these are all factors which you'll all need to trade off. And if you said that, look, we're a University of City X and we're going to work on people in that city, that would be, you know, I would not criticise that for a second.
Brilliant, thanks, Jonathan. And now we're going to move on to the second part of the event, where I have a fantastic panel who are going to obviously respond a bit from what we've just heard, but also talk about this and this agenda within their own context. So just to introduce our panel, firstly, we're going to hear from Chris Skidmore MP. Chris obviously needs no further introduction to people here on the call today, but as you'll know, Chris was formerly the university's minister and is now chair of the All Parliamentary Group for Universities, and most importantly of all, of course, chairs the UPP Foundation's Advisory Board and is one of our trustees. And Chris is going to talk about why this matters politically and also pick up on some of the points which he thinks are really important. Then we're going to hear from both Richard Calvert. Richard is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam, but he's also leading on the establishment of the Civic University Network at Hallam, and Angela Folks, the Principal of Sheffield College. And Richard and Angela are going to be discussing the critical relationship between universities and FE colleges to support these agendas. And then last but not least, we're going to be hearing from Professor Judith Petts, Vice-Chancellor at the University of Plymouth. And Judith is going to be talking about, of course, the role Plymouth plays within the wider region, but crucially how this agenda fits in with supporting coastal communities. And you'll probably note that our report we didn't go and focus group in coastal communities because we thought some of the characteristics there are far too unique to make some more general assumptions. But that is a really important agenda that is clearly plays a big role in terms of levelling up. So we're delighted that Judith is here and is going to talk about that. And I'm going to hand over to Chris. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'd like to thank Jonathan also for excellent presentation, and also the 2 reports that are filled with an abundance of data, which I think is always welcome when it comes to establishing policy foundations. I think in broad overview, both reports present ultimately a paradox, which is that on the one hand, they present the perceived perception that universities are still removed from their local communities and towns, yet at the same time, universities are significant employers in those universities and also have that potential to play a critical role in the retraining and reskilling agenda for many of those local populations. So the political question, I think, is really how do we resolve that paradox? And I believe that this requires, and I'm sure in government also, people will understand that this requires almost a new compact, new social contract between government and universities. In a sense, we need to put the swords away and beat them into plowshares, particularly when it comes to now this post-COVID reconstruction. Personally, as Universities Minister, I'm sure you're all aware, I was always in favour of universities being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I believe as carefully curated institutions formed over generations, that they have the potential to use their brands, their networks, and their local footprints to help deliver on the post-18 education agenda. And that this false HE versus FE debate it needs to be quickly resolved, so that we recognise that we need the HE sector to help deliver on FE qualification reform. And we've seen in recent days work between London South Bank University and Lambeth Council being published, demonstrating the pilot work around the College of the Future. And I would say that from a political perspective, it is the 2nd of May 2024 with the date in the diary that counts here, and that's 1,277 days away. So it's simply impossible to deliver on the scale needed for post-18 education reform without ensuring that universities are a critical part of that higher technical education portrait. So I think what we need to be clear here is that let's not talk about red brick universities anymore. We need to be talking about red wall universities. When I was education minister, I was quite struck, and I remember going to the education secretary at the time with a fistful of letters from local Conservative MPs who'd all written to me around the potential fee cut in Augar and about how that may destabilise their local universities. And I think we've now had a general election with even more Conservative MPs elected with local universities in their constituencies or on their constituency footprint. And I think that needs to be a critical part of the government's acceptance that we do need universities to be part of the red wall agenda. That's not to say that change isn't coming. I think we all know that we can't roll back the tide when it comes to looking at how student debt has now been reclassified by ONS as government debt, and therefore there will be change when it comes to looking at a new financial settlement for courses, which courses are given government funding. We're pointing in that direction. Jonathan's spoken about this. You can clearly see that not all courses will be seen as equal in future, and therefore, rather than fight this, I think it's best that we look to find common ground about how we can direct change, and universities can have a proactive approach to be able to deliver this to be part of the levelling up agenda. And I think that when it comes to analysing that common ground, I place it on 4 key points, so that this whole agenda of place is dependent firstly on people, as Jonathan has articulately spoken about. Secondly, the nature of a physical presence and the identity of that presence. I'll come on to that in a moment. Thirdly, the issue of innovation. We've obviously traditionally had universities being involved in innovation predominantly in city regions, but particularly when it comes to new jobs for the future, what does that innovation look like and how can it be articulated? And fourthly, around the broader issue of community and what communities want. So to touch on people, I think already we've seen, and we're looking at that Venn diagram, the issue of the NHS is obviously a touchstone issue, and it has been through the COVID pandemic, and universities have done a fantastic job, not only with PSCR equipment, but also PPE equipment, and helping to provide trusts with materials and additional students. But we've seen the establishment of 5 new medical schools in recent years in places like Sunderland, in Chelmsford and Lancaster, and others that potentially universities would like to set up in Bolton and Worcester I've been to. And it's clear that is a critical, I think, point where we can try and expand that concept, I think. It's clear we've got to marry it with course innovation. So we've seen in universities like Middlesex, they've looked at the Nurse Associate Programme about creating a faster 2-year degree programme. But I think it's also important to recognise, I think, where the government's moving, which is that obviously if you want to be a nurse, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to be a police officer, then it quite clearly you will not need a degree in the future. You might look to achieve a degree as part of your career, but ultimately we should be working as universities towards looking at how we can provide the necessary qualifications without the full level of degree qualification to be able to enter that profession. I think that looking at the barriers around that whole concept of the 3-year degree and working, as Jonathan said, to more flexible routes, modular routes, and the government needs to provide the funding to be able for the universities to do this, but to meet the ambitions of local people in their communities to step up to be local leaders in public services is definitely a part of that, but it's going to be demand-led. It's got to be demand-led. It's got to be based around what the individuals themselves want, and also the demand that is then needed in the local community for nurses, for police officers, for teachers. The point around physical presence and the identity. Universities take the names of their towns and cities. And I think it's a point of pride, I think, if we can ensure that the universities can succeed holding those names closely. And it's quite clear that some areas have managed to establish USPs, as I'd call it, when it comes to their physical presence. If you look at Sheffield, the government's incredibly interested in the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre there, what they've done around training for high value manufacturing. If you looked at Leicester University and their work with Leicester Space Park, they've just announced new space engineering technician apprenticeships starting in January 2021. So making sure that there is a specialisation. And I think that also points to the fact that when we come to look at what universities will be doing for the future, we've got to reevaluate the concept of a university for the 21st century. Universities are not going to be able to offer every single subject in every single course. You will see universities begin to specialise, and I think that's right that they look to carve out a niche in order to be able to strengthen their local opportunities and agenda. And then when it comes to the power of innovation and the jobs of the future, Minister who signed net zero into law, I would say there's huge opportunities here. Equally, I know Public First have done work on net zero, and the fact that very few members of the public understand the concept of net zero and what this is going to mean for jobs of the future. But it's going to mean that when it comes to those skilled jobs, when it comes to looking at green jobs, universities are going to be needed to help weave the narrative around embracing change rather than seeing this change as a threat and what it can mean for post-industrial towns, because I think there's a huge opportunity to use the facilities of post-industrial towns to be able to deliver on things like carbon capture, utilisation, storage, and other infrastructure requirements for the green agenda. Fourthly, on community, Jonathan's rightly said it must be about what the population wants, not what the university thinks that it wants. And that when it comes to this whole idea of educational missions, I think, for universities, I've always been struck that universities have international education strategies, but where are their local education strategies? So I think being able to recognise that universities have worked hard to recruit international students, they need to work equally hard now on local missions that aren't about the AMP agenda. They are simply about creating that network with colleges, with schools that they may benefit from, they may not benefit from, but ultimately they're benefiting from genuinely rising the educational attainment of the local community. I would say also that then there comes the issue of, firstly, how to measure impact. Do you do this through individual levels of attainment? How are you managing to build those relationships? Are you using students, staff ambassadors to be able to sort of then evaluate what the impact for a university is? And I think also, being able to identify the barriers that currently are in place and to be able to look at how we can overcome those barriers for the future is something that, rather than just saying we need universities to get involved, we do need to understand exactly what is preventing individuals from accessing their universities. I agree entirely the high street is probably the cheapest option to have the biggest impact. As somebody who is a member of parliament for Kingswood, which is a town near Bristol, I currently have several bids in for the Future High Streets Fund, which is also another fund that universities can think about accessing in order to set up a community centre in a historic Grade 1 listed building that's run down and derelict. And universities, even if they were just to put aside a small amount of investment, it could go so far, given that sort of, rent on the high street is about £5,000 a year. Just to rent a shop front and demonstrate a presence would be hugely impactful, and particularly working with local MPs to get the political benefit from that, I think, as well, would also be extremely wise. To finish, I would just like to say that while it seems that we have a culture war raging at the moment between universities and other actors on the stage, I've always believed that we need more culture than war. But if universities do focus on their local culture and their local civic identity, I hope that we may be able to call a ceasefire. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we'll all heed the wanting more culture than war comments. And also, you made a really important point around the force divide between HE and FE. And I think on that point, I'll move on now to hear from Richard Calvert, Angela Fawkes, to talk about the critical role that HE and FE in partnership plays in Sheffield. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. And I think, like others, I found this a really timely and helpful report, not just as we're all getting to grips with what does COVID mean and what is it going to mean over the period ahead for our communities and localities, but also, as you mentioned earlier, Richard, because a lot of us as universities are thinking about what does a civic role really mean, and through the work of the civic university agreements to really challenge ourselves. And I think, one of the things which is really at the heart of that civic agenda is for universities not just to do more of what they found easy or comfortable in the past, but to really challenge themselves to understand and to engage with what localities need and want from them. And I think this report underlines that message, and certainly underlines what would be our own analysis within Sheffield and South Yorkshire, that we may be well known as an institution, but we're not necessarily, and very often not, well understood, and don't ourselves understand well enough some of the communities that we are here to support and serve. And I think there's a challenge at lots of levels for universities within this, and a lot within the report which I could pick up. But as you say, Richard, I'm going to focus in particularly on education and skills and different aspects of that. I think as universities, and indeed, I'm going to take the liberty of broadening this out beyond just universities, but I think as institutions in our local educational landscape, often we are thinking about what we specifically want to offer and how we want to kind of sharpen that offer. We're not necessarily always thinking about what does it look like and feel like from the learner's perspective. And I think particularly from the perspective of those learners who are not necessarily coming through a traditional route where they always know that they're heading for a traditional university degree, or they're heading for an FE qualification, but very often might not know, and might find that their route through the educational landscape is not a simple and straightforward one. And I'm going to just pull out and then hand over to Angela to I'm sure add more and elaborate. I'm going to pull out 4 themes which I think have been really important to us thinking about this from Sheffield, but also from a kind of wider university perspective. I mean, the first thing, and I'm sure this is true of regions beyond South Yorkshire. South Yorkshire is not a huge geographical area, but it can feel like one side of it is very different from other sides. And our political and our educational history in South Yorkshire is not one that has always been of instinctive collaboration. And I say that, with all, respect to the history and tradition of the different parts of South Yorkshire, but we have not always instinctively thought of our ability to work together as our first priority. And I think one of the things with Angela and with others over the last few years, we've been really trying to challenge ourselves on is, why is that? What really is holding us back from taking a more coherent view across South Yorkshire of the educational provision we offer, how it fits together, and critically, how does it feel for learners who are progressing through that system? And I think, the concept of educational pathways is a really simple one at one level, but it's one that we know is often for institutions and learners very hard. And that might be because we're simply not thinking in terms of curriculum, how does our provision fit together and how do our qualifications fit together? But often it can be about really simple things like, how easy is it to progress from a level 4-5 qualification at Sheffield College into a level 6 top up at Hallam? How easy is it to progress through from level 2 and 3 qualifications into higher qualifications? How do we join up with apprenticeships now? Helping learners to understand how they can steer a coherent way through that and how we can support them is really critical. And I think the partnership with FE colleges has been really important for us and will be more important going forward. I think the second thing that comes out of this is the need to challenge traditional attitudes in all of those players in the educational landscape. And, we in universities are certainly not, can't excuse ourselves in that. We know that as institutions, like all big institutions, we often look inwards. We often focus on how we've done things in the past rather than necessarily how we need to do things in the future. And I think within universities in particular, there is a challenge around really shaping strategically the overall coherence of our offer as institutions. A lot of our history is around academic provision built up from strong faculty subject college bases. And as we work through with FE partners and others, a more coherent offer, we have to challenge ourselves in how do we think about the future development of our academic offer. The third thing, and we have to look for positives in the last 6 to 9 months. And I think one of the positives that I certainly see in the last 6 to 9 months is that we and so many other institutions have proved to ourselves our ability to change at a pace that we would never have believed possible. And I think as we look out across where our offer can go in some of the areas which are highlighted in this report. Some of that may include physical presence, but actually I'm increasingly interested in what does it look like in terms of a more flexible offer as we've learned as institutions to blend face-to-face and online and different modes of delivery. And I think as we do think about how do we reach some of those areas which don't have a traditional university presence, thinking about what are some of those lessons from the last 6 months and reminding ourselves that our ability to change is much greater than we probably would have given ourselves credit for. There are some real opportunities there. And then just the fourth thing I'm going to say, and it picks up some of the things that Jonathan's highlighted about students and around education through from early years right through, is understanding the power of the university community in its entirety. So, the 35,000 plus people who make up Sheffield Hallam students and staff, we have a huge range of skills and experiences. One of the things we've been working on over the last few years is a program which is really thinking about how do we use the skills and capacity of that group to support educational attainment and aspiration much more broadly across the city and the region. And it opens up, I think, a way of thinking about the power of universities, which is not simply about institutional initiatives, but it's about really tapping into the resource and capacity of those institutions. And we've had a huge range of things through tapping into all sorts of very specific academic areas, skills areas, volunteering, mentoring, using our students as mentors, which I think just opens up again a slightly different way of thinking about this agenda. I'm going to stop there, Richard, and I'm going to let Angela take the story on a bit.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you for inviting me today. I have had the privilege of being involved in the Civic University since pretty much the beginning via Sheffield Hallam. So it's been really interesting journey though, because I think one of the things that I would say after far too many years in FE is that FE is firmly rooted in a civic movement and still is. And that one of the strengths that we have in FE is that we are and always have been highly adaptable, mostly because we've had to be, because the swift changes in our landscape, I mean, they're sort of every year and sometimes twice a year. And this last 7 months has not made any difference to that, quite frankly. And there's a fair amount of change coming for FE colleges in the future, as I'm sure you all know. We seem to be getting, as a sector, a fair amount of attention at the moment, which is good stuff. So I think we've some shared challenges at the moment. Urgently, we have challenges around the 16 to 25 age group who need access to a different kind of market, a different kind of education skills and training market. There's a growth in demographics, but there's also, as is Jonathan pointed out really succinctly, a lack of opportunity. So we need to sort of work together on that challenge. There's a challenge for apprentices. So this year we've seen a significant decline in new starts on our apprenticeship programs, as you'd expect in the current circumstances. But that hits the 16 to 18 market quite hard because they are also a lower demographic in apprenticeship. And the adult retraining and upskilling challenge is that's plain and clear. I think just very, very briefly, it might be worth, for the sake of anybody in the audience who's kind of not as familiar with FE. So over the last 10 years, the FE sector has experienced a real-time cut of 30% in funding in general terms, which is significant, and yet we continue. 50% of funding for adults has been cut. So some of what I agree with a significant amount of what Jonathan was saying earlier in terms of the lifetime skills guarantee, but in the context of 19+ funding being reduced by 50% in the last 10 years, it's something. And we do need to fight for more, and we will carry on doing that. But it's significant that we have had a deliberate decline in adult education over the last 10 years. And that teachers in FE colleges on average earn 20% less than those in schools, and are highly skilled dual professionals. So there's lots of work to do that I think we can do together on those kinds of issues. Colleges educate 2.2 million people a year across the country, and over 1.4 million of those people are adults. So what we're talking about today is incredibly relevant from a partnership point of view. I think some of what Chris was alluding to is really interesting, because we work in FE, we work from entry level to level 7. Predominantly with young people, so I'd say 16 to 24, we're looking at level 2 and level 3 predominantly. But we do work all the way through to level 7, and I think that has previously hindered our ability to work in partnership. That there's unnecessary competition generated by policy and not necessarily by people, so it becomes much more transactional. And relationships between FE and HE have been quite transactional. They're based on validation relationships for level 4, 5, 6, 7 programs. They're based on a kind of competitive foothold in places. And some of the things that we're talking about today, FE colleges already occupy the space that is described in the report, occupy that town space, and are delivering beyond level 3. And I think that is something that shouldn't be lost in the discussion, because a lot of that provision is incredibly high quality, is already there and can be built on rather than discarded. And that's that, let's talk about it, let's not war about it. I think Chris is quite right. But there is a tendency to kind of get a bit caught in a deficit model and not recognise what's already happening in the locality that's very, very good. In South Yorkshire, there's a strong collaboration of the colleges, and that should mean that anyone can study locally up to level 4, 5, 6, and in some places level 7. But Richard is right. Even though all of that exists and it is a strong collaborative movement, the system is confused. So the way that FE colleges work, we work in all kinds of arena, and we cross over between schools and universities, and we do lots of alternative provision. And a lot of what we do is innovative, but at the same time, you know, hiding the wiring is absolutely crucial. So the comment about learners accessing the system, if we simplify the system through collaboration, that would be amazing. I really think that would transform lives, because I think people would engage in a different way. I think if we can recognise productive partnership and set aside kind of institutional ego and that sort of financial imperative, whilst we talk about people and place and productivity, I think that we could achieve something really incredible. I don't think the lifetime skills guarantee goes far enough. I think offering 4 years across a lifetime isn't a lifetime, but, you know, depending on your life circumstances. But I do recognise that that's an attempt to build a level 3 pipeline. And I don't think that should be lost, because there's not enough people in our locality, certainly, but wider than that across the country, who have a level 3 that can then progress to level 4 and 5 for high level skills. So we have to build the level 3 pipeline. And that first announcement is certainly linked to that in my opinion. In terms of level 4 and 5, the secondary part of the announcement is that colleges can access the same sort of funding for loans that universities can already access, in an attempt to prime that level 4 and 5 market. And I agree, Jonathan, it just isn't enough. We need to do more. And we need to recognise but not everyone is prepared or able to take out those loans or equipped to take out those loans to do that, where we have level 4 and 5 deficits. And in terms of lifelong learning for adults, that, you know, the moment we're driven, very heavily driven by outcomes that are related to work and employment and careers. And if we can focus on careers rather than courses, but build skills that are transferable, build skills that are about employability, as opposed to taking people deliberately at level 2 and 3 down specific routes, we probably will build a better adult model, a better adult system. I think there's lots to talk about. Richard and I talk about this quite a lot, that what we have to do is keep an eye on what will benefit people in our place and how do we work with employers. So colleges have a long-standing history of excellent work with employers. Most of what we do is tailored to employers. We're a bit held by qualifications, but we try to work around that by building experiences that lead to, yes, a qualification, but it's actually much more about the skills and the broader holistic experience of people learning to work that matter more. And if we can focus in on people and place and set aside the urge to compete, the drive to compete, the drive to be sustainable and to kind of maximize opportunity for institutions and bring that back to people and place, then I think we really have an opportunity to realize potential and to offer clear and realistic opportunities for people, particularly in Sheffield. And what I would say, last thing I'm going to say is that it's not easy. It really isn't easy, because the place that we're in at the moment is that we do have an awful lot of crossover, but we are learning to find things that actually benefit our locality much, much more if we share our ambition, and if we do the bits of some of these pieces of work we're currently working on, if we do the bits that we're best at and join up so that there is a route through for people. And that we're learning to work in that way, in a much better way than we were, I would say, 2 years ago at least. But we still have some way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Richard, for that. And some really important messages there around FE and HE collaboration rather than competition, and effective partnership to support place and people. Judith, over to you on how this relates to Plymouth and coastal communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very pleased to join today, very much supporting the report. And we'll probably follow up quite a few of the things that Angela has just said. So Plymouth is a core city. It's a coastal city in a massive region. Just reflect on the fact that it's a 4.5-hour train journey from Bristol to Penzance, which is only 20 minutes shorter than the train journey from London to Edinburgh. And I think that just about sums up the scale of the region in which we operate in, and we very much have the characteristics of a university of our region. And from our history, that's how it's developed. So we operate and partner across the region. We actually deliver education in Exeter and in Truro. We partner with our FE colleges across the region and have done with some of them for over 40 years. And something like 5,000 students currently get a University at Plymouth qualification from one of those FE colleges. And I'll come back to the really important point about validation versus strategic development with our colleges. We are, of course, a coastal community and very much a coastal and rural region. But that doesn't negate the fact that Plymouth has one of the largest manufacturing groups of companies south of Birmingham, and therefore has very particular characteristics as a city, as well as being a very regionally focused operation. We actually sit, of course, on the border between Devon and Cornwall, so the natural relationships at Plymouth are very much in and down to Penzance. Something like 30% of my students commute, some actually commute daily up from places like Truro to Plymouth. So there are long distances traveled, there are long connections made, and that very much influences our view. As a region, we have been spared some of the worst elements of COVID so far. However, we have some of the lowest productivity in the country, and the economic impact of COVID is likely to be one of the most severe in the country for the region, we are, of course, heavily dependent on the tourism sector in particular, and we will see that. I should perhaps just reflect that as a Vice-Chancellor and board member of our LEP, which is Heart of the South West, covers Devon and Somerset. I sit on the board of the steering group of the Great South West Partnership, which is Cornwall, Isles of Scilly, Devon, Somerset and Dorset as the 3 LEP areas. And so very much see the conversation at the moment about recovery across the region and the role of the universities, multiple in the region. I'd like to pull out 1 or 2 things from the report, and starting with town centre regeneration. We're inherently linked to our city, and we're, well, probably at least apart from the hospital, the major business in our city. And working with city regeneration in Plymouth is core to actually Plymouth's role as a regional city. That's the largest city in the region below Bristol. And we have already bid this year with the Future High Street Fund, with our city and with Urban Splash Redevelopment Company, to bring new high economic and social value uses into 2 major listed buildings in the city. We're awaiting the results on that one. We're actually the catalyst for redevelopment of Plymouth Railway Station, which is a hub for the region in that it's sort of halfway between Penzance and Bristol in train time. And we are taking a 12-storey, what was Intercity House, and refurbishing that. And as the catalyst that drives the redevelopment of the whole station itself, we will put our allied health profession work in there. And thirdly, very differently, we're a partner with multiple partners in the area and nationally on the designation of the first national marine park in Plymouth Sound. That will have significant implications for a whole variety of sectors, from research through to visitor attraction, enable a huge boost to the economy for the city and the region. I would just like to reflect on the fact that these types of large-scale partnerships are built, in my experience, from a long history of trust and confidence building. They're not something you can just switch on overnight because someone's delivered a large pot of cash that you might be able to access. They come from an inherent background of trust and confidence, and of course an ability to see regeneration and development as part and core to the local economy and your city, and therefore the interrelationship between the university's priorities and the cities and the region's priorities is very close. They're not either or, as perhaps the report might suggest at one stage. Within the region, we've had a long history, and here I come to another possible problem, of support from European and regional funding for support to small and medium-sized businesses. We have run a growth acceleration and investment network for over 10 years. That funding has now stopped, but the network of nearly 10,000 companies continues right across the region, and hugely supported by a concept of regional support to which the university brings its expertise. I would like to reflect on the fact that training graduates for our area is sometimes seen by government as a problem, in that 60% of our students come from the Southwest, 65% choose to stay in the Southwest, but there aren't graduate jobs for all of them. So whilst we continue to somehow view courses as only important if they produce graduate and high-level graduate outcomes, it might be important to see a different conceptualization of the value you bring for your students in your area, as opposed to, and I think Angela reflected on this, the students from the course per se and the value of that course. Boosting attainment in schools and for adults, absolutely agree. We partner with all of our colleges across, right the way down from Truro, Cornwall College, Truro and Penrith, City College in Plymouth, South Devon College in Paignton, Exeter College in Exeter, Petrock College, which is in Tiverton and Barnstable. So we partner and have done for some of those for 40 years. And therefore bringing through this, this approach to a pathway and trajectory of students in colleges from levels 4, 5, and actually from 3 as well, through to level 7, we will need to move from just validating for colleges to a whole strategic partnership with our colleges and how to optimize those pathways. That's started to happen, absolutely, but will require us to do more work. And then I'd like to say something about the NHS and training. We deliver 5,000 nurses and allied health professions for the Southwest already, and then we also have a medical and dental school on top. We're currently in discussion ourselves and with our colleges and also Exeter University with the 2 STPs for Devon and Somerset, and Devon and for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. They reckon they need between 500 and 1,000 additional registered nurses per year, just for those regions and for those areas. So we're in discussion with them of the potential for a whole new model of degree of apprenticeship, which would enable healthcare assistants to take 2 years in colleges, 2 years in universities as top up in a whole new apprenticeship model for registered nursing. We already delivered registered nurses and we also already deliver apprenticeship models. But I think it's an indicator of the drive, particularly in the NHS, for real massive growth in staffing, and how do you achieve that in an optimal way, and what is the role of universities with its colleges to do that. I'd like to reflect also on our dental school, which was a new model dental school opened in 2008. We actually deliver through a social enterprise our training and community development of health in dental health by that model. So we operate 4 dental facilities, 2 in Plymouth, one in Truro and 1 in Exeter, which enables us to actually bring our students into dental care at 6 months into their course. For those who don't like their dentist, that's quite a thought to have your student looking after your teeth when they've only just been 6 months on their course, but it enables us to deliver at-hand training in our communities and deliver therefore something like 10,000 NHS appointments for dental appointments per year, and importantly to work with young people and schools and young children in terms of dental care. So it's a new model of delivery. It's been there since 2008, but it's something I think we can learn from. Finally, around research and innovation, closely involved with our discussions in the region because of roles with our LEP and with our Great Southwest Partnership around recovery for the region and the local industrial strategy. And the university's roles in driving innovation and supporting recovery and employment will be crucial. For us, particularly in the marine sector, marine engineering, marine science, importantly in low carbon, offshore renewables and floating wind technology, which is all part of the inherent environment of the Southwest, but also cutting edge work in cyber security linked to our marine industry and the defence sector in Plymouth. Working closely with the NHS trusts as well around core development of health technology with our science park, which was jointly owned with our city council. But we also manage 3 innovation centres in Cornwall, so a long way from us, but also linked again inherently to the science strengths of the university. And I think that natural empathy of universities who deliver highly impactful research with the companies across their regions will be something to capitalise on quickly, particularly picking up, I think, Chris's earlier point about low carbon as core to recovery for companies as we come out of COVID. So I think I'd say that there are interesting reflections on how do we operate like this. That's partly because the scale and nature of the geography of our region. I am a geographer, so I can relate to this fairly easily, but also the strength of relationships that get developed over time. And so I would urge that throwing money at things is thrown in a directed way to where it's likely to be able to be capitalized on because of the type of relationships that universities have in their local areas. I would also say that we need to reflect on the loss of European funding, and particularly for an area like the Southwest, ERDF and ESIF funding. It's been hugely important to a number of the developments, particularly in terms of employment and skills. And that will need to be thought about carefully in the way that things like Shared Prosperity Fund, et cetera, are used to replace that funding, because there is no doubt that it has driven a lot of the relationships that as a university we have with our industries, with our colleges, and with our partners across the region. We operate in partner with our other core universities in the region, and that is important. And indeed, our civic engagement and our civic network sign up is a conversation between, for example, ourselves and Exeter University. So there's a lot I think we can build on, but I think we should learn from what's created and driven and sustained a number of our partnerships and how to ensure we hold on to those characteristics. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judith, for that comprehensive response. We're now going to move on to the Q&A part of the discussion. I think we've got 12 minutes left, so we'll try and get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. I'll let the panelists have a little breathe. I'll move over to Jonathan first. There was a couple of important questions from Mike Ratcliffe from Nottingham Trent University, both around the data analysis that we've used in the report and satellite campuses, and then more broadly, a question around why we haven't really considered satellite campuses within the sort of levelling up agenda for this report. To take the first one, I'm very happy to say that obviously this is a piece of work from us and you, and inevitably there are going to be things in our map that we want to improve. So if there are any things that you think are wrong or we should change, then do let us know. And as somebody who's a graduate at the University of Essex, and I know you pointed out the Southend Satellite Campus, and as a Southend United fan who are currently bottom of the football pyramid, perhaps that's something that we should have noted, but thank you for that. But Jonathan, is there anything more widely you want to say around satellite campuses and why we haven't really included that in the report?
Yeah, I think on the point about satellite campuses, we're absolutely not saying that they are not the answer. We took a decision to discount discussion of them from this report only because the concept of them is relatively well established. So we didn't want to say that they are the only answer, because there are some that have worked really, really well, and there are some that have not. And we didn't want to say this is an option because we felt it was relatively well understood what it looks like as an option. So in a sense, when we say discounted it, we really mean discounted it as an option for this report. But absolutely, as Mike, as you say, and Southend campus is a really good example of that. There are great examples of where satellite campuses have done exactly this type of work, and they could and should be options for lots of universities, and we don't want to discount them. I'm also struck by one of the other questions that said, as indeed Richard talked about in his speech, about virtual learning. And we've all suddenly learned how to do virtual learning in the past 6 months in a way that, there's been lots of abstract discussions about it for the last 10 years or more, but actually, push has come to shove in the last 6 months and we are now there. So I also didn't want to overdo the point around physical campuses, because it could well be that actually a university can have a huge impact through its online learning. So I think both online learning and offline learning have a place as the satellite campuses. And so they're definitely an option, but just for the purpose of this report, we wanted to think about other things that were newer than those.
Thank you, Jonathan. Moving quickly on to another question, there's a really interesting question from Rachel Sanby-Thomas from Warwick University about the gap between learner motivation and labour market needs. She says has been a constant problem. And how do we narrow that gap? There might be some disagreement on this panel, which is what we always want when we're having a discussion. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that teases out. Angela, can I hand that over to you initially? Yeah, sure. Whenever somebody asks this question, I have it's a horrible 10-year argument we have about hairdressing. It's a never-ending argument. So we, there are curriculum areas, there are things, there are pathways that people desire to do that aren't necessarily held in as high esteem as perhaps they could be outside of education. And there's something about, I'm going to come back to that comment I made about employability. So we work hard in FE on transferable skills. So a level 2 qualification in hair or in beauty offers a young person and adult, we have quite a lot of adults who do courses in service industries, offers a set of skills in customer service, in people, in a range of employability that is really useful if you go into another career at a different point. And
there's something that's lacking in an understanding of that. And I suspect that this could rage as an argument for ages. But I really think it's important we talk to employers about some of this, because when we talk to employers, they say we want people who can solve problems, talk to people, who understand what it's like to be at work, who are they are problem solvers in their own right, they innovate, they've got ambition for themselves, you know, they want to work. What they never say is, please, can they never have ever done a hair qualification? They never say that. There's something mismatched about the way we feel, you know, the way we accept sometimes, that mismatch between people wanting to learn, the ambition to learn, and what you can learn from being in learning, and careers, you know, and sustainable careers. And this is about more than a one-year program. This is about helping people to understand how to be employable and how to sustain work in the long term. And I think it's really valid. And I think that you know, the question is valid, but I also think that just learning itself at level 2, certainly, and then at level 3, it gives you a wide range of skills, and it gives you skills for longer lifelong learning as well.
Thank you, Angela. But to pass over to Chris, do you think, is there a concern in policy terms for sort of tertiary education that we're moving from we could move from a system which is very purely market orientated, which probably hasn't recognised the needs and concerns of place, to one that's too overly focused on labour market needs and not the sort of demand and needs of learners, and how we get that right balance between the two?
Yeah, I think the greatest danger we face is an over-reliance on LEO data sets, which are currently immature in terms of their analytical ability to predict for the future. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, this decade is going to see a transformation in the nature of demand, particularly around manufacturing, construction, and we've got to be able to anticipate that, which is why I think it's so important that we set aside investment in course innovation and in terms of innovation for qualifications that might be needed to deliver on those jobs for the future. You know, the greatest risk is that we would develop a strategy around labour market demand that is rapidly out of date, particularly as Jonathan's startling figures show that there are going to be many industries and employment opportunities that will cease to exist. So given that higher education is often, at the very least, 3 to 5 years behind the current demand as individuals sort of come through the system, we've got to be able to make sure that we recognise that. And you know, my greatest problem with the LEO data set has been that it's working on individuals, I think, who are traced back to 2008, and I mean, a lot of things have happened since 2008. So making sure that we recognise the new jobs that are available, but I think also the point around public services stand. You know, we're going to need public services more than ever. The government has made strong commitments, whether you agree with them or not, regardless of your political persuasion, that you know, mistakes were made in the past around austerity, and that it wants to reinvest now in the NHS. It wants to reinvest in teacher supply. So there's clearly going to be sort of demand there, and obviously the whole build back greener, the housing agenda. We know there are catastrophic shortages in the labour market when it comes to construction. So understanding how to fill those gaps as well is equally important.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to move on to another question now, as we've got a few minutes left, and ask Judith really about, there's a question here about widening participation and more generally the wider role, I think, of the Office for Students. And is there any sort of recommendations that you would make to them in terms of to advance this agenda, particularly around WP and also raising attainment locally, and what are the sort of things that they could be doing to support you better in this area?
So I think a lot of discussion, of course, on access and participation plans, which has tended to shift the language a bit from widening participation to the whole student journey in the university. Traditionally, for us, about 33% of our students come from polar quintiles 1 and 2, from disadvantaged communities, from people who have been in care as childhood experience. And I think raising attainment is about raising the experience of people who come from different backgrounds and how to manage in the university environment so that you stay, so they are retained and that they stay and benefit from the university experience. And that is part and parcel of that more extended access and participation sort of drive of OFS. However, we also have to question whether for some people being able to dip in and out of higher education is something that could be attractive to them to meet their own family and life issues, but also to come in and out into a degree. And we've seen, of course, the massive drop-off in part-time higher education. And so I think we need to look at the models of what is beneficial to people who come with different backgrounds, different experience into higher education, and how they can benefit from different models of delivery. And it's been traditional to look at it that they come for a 3-year degree and they move straight into the experience of higher education on that basis. So I think being more flexible, which comes back to a lot of the discussion already today about the nature of higher education, is crucial. And providing those funding mechanisms which are flexible for people to come in and out is also crucial, so that you have the best chances of success if you start a course. Can I pick up one other thing which I think is really important? Someone's put on the chat line, but I'm sure it's in the Q&A. The balance between the civic imperatives of particularly the old post-92s and being an international postgraduate and research-oriented university. I see all of these as absolutely in line with one another. So I don't see a old post-92 as being a civic university only. I can deliver the best civic by being an international university with huge international research strength, an international student community, and operating in other cultures and countries as well. So I think the interrelationship between the civic and the other roles of universities is crucial to hold on to. And I will certainly never see Plymouth as only a civic university, absolutely not. And our strategy documents would show you that. We benefit by being an international university and what we can bring that to the civic, and we can take our civic in our learning as we operate around the world in other cultures, communities, and other cities around the world as well. And so please, let's bring those two languages together.
Thank you, Judith. And I'll ask one more question to Richard Calvert as it's time for us to conclude. There's a question from our good friend John Goddard here on what you think the Civic University Network should play in taking this agenda forward. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for you to plug the network and say what you're doing next.
Thank you, Richard. I just absolutely endorse the point Judith has just made about not seeing the civic agenda as somehow a separate agenda from our wider strategy and aspirations as an institution. I think that's absolutely right, and one of the key messages of the network. Okay, look, time is very tight, so I'm going to just say two very quick things about what can the Civic University Network do. It is a great opportunity for sharing experience and practice and bringing people together across the sector. Some of those sessions, some of those links are good and strong already, but we've seen, I think, in the last 6 months that there's been real value, even within regions where you would think that institutions are well connected in bringing people together and in sharing experience and challenge. But the second thing I'm going to say, and I think this is also really, really important, we need to understand the impact of our civic activity. I think as a sector, we have not done enough to get beyond things which we feel are making a difference and which kind of fit with our ambitions. We haven't done enough to understand what difference they're really making on the ground in localities, and in particularly in the localities that we may be less familiar with within our region. So I think the work that the network is doing around really measuring civic impact, around the concept of a civic index, is going to be really important as we work through this over the next couple of years. Because if we work really hard on this and we're actually missing the mark again, it's going to be a real shame.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. And we've run out of time, but I just want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers, to Jonathan, obviously from Public First and his support and the team support for our reports today, to Richard, to Angela, to Chris, to Judith, to the team at the Civic University Network who've helped put this on, Shireen and Helen in particular. And to all of you who have managed to come here today, and thank you so much. And if there are any questions which we haven't answered, and I know there are several that we haven't been able to answer, we will answer them in the outputs, and drop us a line if there's anything further you'd like to know about the reports. On your screen now, for those of you who are still there, is the next event for the Civic University Network on the 30th of November, reimagining the relationship between universities and the NHS, and there couldn't be a more important topic at this time. So do sign up to that on the Eventbrite page. And for now, we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for coming. Take care.